I've heard the stories of park rangers finding random staircases in the woods. That only happens to those guys out in the Pacific Northwest and the Rocky Mountains, though. See, down here in the South, if you find a staircase in the woods, it was most likely part of some old fur trapper's cabin or a rich man's hunting retreat. In the South, we have a completely different problem. In the South, people are real attached to their religion. There are towns with nearly as many churches as people. That's why our problem is a little more pressing and problematic. If somebody sees a church out in the woods, they think it's a gripping part of history, and they need to prove their fealty by walking right on in the front door. Tourists really ain't much better. They see a church in the woods and they think it must be some historic relic from some backwards congregation. So they march right on in to get a selfie with some broken down pews and have a good laugh at those crazy hillbillies. They really can't pass up the chance to feel like a self-righteous Indiana Jones. Nobody realizes that the Forest Service tore down most of the churches and cabins years ago. There is no church in the wild. There is no God in the jungle, but evil never sleeps. Let me rewind this story. I'm already getting ahead of myself. I started as a forest ranger when I was 25 years old. I had joined the local sheriff's department at age 21, and 6 months later I found myself in basic law enforcement training. By the time I was 22, the back roads of a rural southern county were my beat. I handled everything from serving warrants to looking for lost kids. After a couple of years, it got old. I had already been shot once after stumbling across a marijuana farm. Plus, honestly, most of the night shifts were spent sitting alone in a patrol car, staring out at some stretch of blacktop and trying to stay awake. It wasn't an adventure. It was just a job. So, when I accidentally stumbled across a job listing that offered a 20% raise to go hiking in the woods, I jumped at the opportunity. Yeah, I would still be a cop, but what was the worst that could happen? I was raised a country boy. I could handle the woods better than most. I started off wonderfully. I was assigned to a small 200-acre state nature reserve area. The work was light and pretty easy. I spent my days hiking the trails, talking to hikers, and occasionally running off kids that decided the river was a great alternative to sitting in class. The worst thing that happened in those first 3 years was a kid getting swept away in the current after some heavy rains. It was one of only a handful of real emergencies in that time frame. It seemed like being a ranger would be a life of luxury. I even managed to add certificates in fire protection technologies and animal care and management to my resume thanks to online classes and ample downtime. I was laying the groundwork for a promotion while getting a tan. Life was perfect. Then news came down that I was getting a transfer. I was getting shipped off to the largest park in the state. It covered nearly 9,300 acres in 2 counties and averaged nearly 1.2 million visitors a year. I arrived for my orientation period in mid-spring. The days were warm and the nights were cold. We still had a couple weeks before the visitors started pouring in, so I would spend 2 weeks working nights with another ranger and then start days just as the big cultural festival began. Over the course of 3 days, 65,000 people would visit the park. The nights went as well as could be expected. With an area 2/3 the size of Manhattan, I learned there was no way to learn every nook and cranny, but I was confident. Day shift training started just as the first RVs rolled through the park gates on a Friday morning. The train of vehicles stretched out over 5 miles of rural country roads. My training ranger, Robert, and I were assigned to traffic control. Traffic control is the bane of any officer's existence. It will make you question the average IQ of the human race in a spectacular fashion. So I was relieved when we received a call over the radio. It was a lost child last seen near Beckett's Ridge. It sounds like an awful call. A lost child is scary and emotions are high. However, Beckett's Ridge is the type of place where the landscape makes it easy to think you've lost someone even though they're only 20 yards away. The terrain is full of dips and weird curves that can trick the eyes. So with a smile on my face, I hopped on the all-terrain gator with Robert and we sped off. When we arrived, I knew this was anything but ordinary. The mother was sitting on a fallen log in a catatonic state. She couldn't speak and was completely unresponsive to any stimulus. I tried snapping my fingers in her face and touching her shoulder. She sat stiff as a statue. The father was walking in circles, muttering to himself and running his fingers through his hair. Occasionally he would let out a scream. Their other child was the only one that seemed to be behaving in a normal manner. He was a 7-year-old boy with dirty blonde hair and a carefree expression on his face. That naturally meant he was the one I questioned. "When was the last time you saw your sibling?" "When Mommy stopped to tie my shoe. He was over by the fence talking to the nice man in the black suit." "In the black suit? Was there anything special about this black suit?" "It looked really old, like the one Great-Grandpa wears to church. He couldn't be a bad man if he looked just like Great-Grandpa. He even gave Eddie a piece of candy." My heart dropped, and Robert's face went pale. This wasn't a kid that just stepped over a fallen log or walked off the trail. Robert got on the radio and sent out the preliminary information. He also requested a couple officers from the local sheriff's department. We were going to shut down all traffic leaving the park until a search could be coordinated. I got more information about Eddie from the kid and put it on the radio. After assuring the parents we were going to do our best, we headed down the trail in the direction Eddie was last seen walking. It took us less than 3 minutes to find the first signs. There was a piece of bright red fabric hanging from a branch beside the trail. It was more like a clump of threads than a piece of fabric, but it matched the description of Eddie's shirt, fire engine red. I dipped off the trail and found another clump of threads 10 yards southeast of the trail. I radioed for Robert to join me and headed off into the trees. The sounds of animals surrounded us. There were birds singing, squirrels in the trees, and I even saw a fox scurrying away from us. They all made sounds, but there was nothing that sounded like another human walking through the trees. We continued on for nearly half a mile until we reached Clements Creek. The first thing I noticed as we approached the creek was that the only sounds were our footsteps. When the realization hit me, I stopped and put my hand on my gun. Something about the silence sent a shiver through my body. Animals usually don't go silent unless there's a predator nearby or weather is about to take a nasty turn. The sky was the crystal clear blue of a bottomless lake. That left me with only one other consideration. As I crept through the trees, I flipped the restraining strap on my holster forward and began to blade my stance. When I broke the tree line, confusion washed over me. Sitting on the eastern bank was something I had never seen before. Well, I'd seen one before, but not here. It hadn't been there 3 nights before when I was standing in this exact spot with Robert listening to a lecture on navigating the park using the stars in the creek. I know it wasn't here because I had crossed the creek right beside the large overhanging rock they called Panther's Throne. The same rock was 30 yards north of where I stood. But now there was something besides 2 acres of open grass on the other side. A small church with an A-frame roof sat dead center of the field. It was an old clapboard structure that looked like it had been there forever. The boards were rough-hewn and weather-worn. A handful of fieldstone steps led up to the front door. It looked like something out of a William Faulkner or a Louis L'Amour novel. I looked to Robert for some words of explanation as he came through the trees. He had nothing to offer. He came to a halt so fast that he slipped and fell flat on his back. Time slowed as I glanced from Robert to the old church and back again. Then the world shifted gears and everything went into hyperdrive. The front door of the church flew open with a crack, and I looked back across the creek. In the doorway stood a little boy in a ripped and tattered fire engine red t-shirt. His face was a mask of pain and confusion. Without hesitation, I broke into a sprint toward the creek. Behind me, I could hear Robert, a world away, screaming, "Stand down, Ranger!" I hit the creek at full speed. My boots sunk into the muddy bottom and began to fill with water. Quickly, it began to feel like I was dragging 2 lead weights with my ankles and knees. I slipped and fell on my face. Mud and water filled my nose and mouth. The water soaked my ballistic vest and pressed down on my back. The weight threatened to force the air out of my lungs. I became terrified that I wouldn't be able to stand with my newfound burden. I thrusted my hands into the creek bottom, trying to push myself up or just forward some fraction, and they disappeared beneath the silt. I rock-rolled from beneath my palm. The shifting balance teamed with the current to send me spiraling onto my back. I could see the crystal blue lake of the sky getting darker every second. At some point, I managed to get a foot squarely on the bottom as I tried to right myself. I shoved with everything I had left and managed to pop above the surface. I was facing the wrong way, but I was alive and gasping. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to turn back around. I dragged the weight of all the mud and water through the current and up the eastern bank. With my legs and lungs burning, I began hustling forward with everything left in me. I developed tunnel vision as I fought my way forward, so it took me a second to realize that an old man now stood behind Eddie. The old man wore a crooked smirk, but that wasn't what scared me. There was something else in that church. It was something big enough to block out most of the light coming from the southern-facing windows. I don't have words to describe what I saw that day. It looked like a human, but it wasn't. It looked like a bad impressionist portrait of what a human should be. The edges of it were blurry, and the skin looked like it was covered with swirls and ridges as it tried to coalesce. That doesn't do it justice. There was just so much wrong with what I was seeing that my mind begged for me to turn away as horror gripped my stomach and heart. I let out a scream as I unholstered my pistol. Closing the last 24 yards, a smell began to waft toward me. It was like someone burning clove and sage to hide the rot of death. Then as I hit the bottom step, the thing standing behind the old man let out a scream. It wasn't really audible. It was more like a subharmonic wave that struck my amygdala and triggered something primal. My knees quivered, my breath caught, tears flowed from my eyes as fear coursed down every nerve in my body. The church door slammed shut as my body gave up, and I crashed forward. My head smacked the giant iron cross, and it struck me as odd that the long vertical part stretched above the horizontal bars. It was nearly midnight when I woke up in the hospital emergency room. Robert was perched on the edge of a chair in the corner, staring at his feet. When he looked up, I could see relief wash over the stone of anxiety that had become his face. I will never forget the conversation we had. Where am I? We had you life-flighted out of the park. You've been here nearly 12 hours. Where is Eddie? Eddie is gone. There isn't a single trace of him, and there won't ever be. Those threads we found are the only things besides his family's memories that prove he was ever in the park. We've got a team of deputies, state rangers, and federal guys searching the park now. They'll never find the kid, though. Well, maybe in a year or two he'll turn up somewhere, but it won't be in our park. The old man got out of the church? There was no church. Bullshit, I saw... You didn't see shit. Robert got up and went to the door. He looked both ways down the corridor and then shut it. There was nothing there. I didn't see anything. You didn't see anything. Some old pervert slipped out of the park with a kid. Do you understand me? I know what I saw, Robert. There was an old church on the eastern side of that creek. I was damn near inside it when... You didn't see shit. You start going around talking about what you think you saw, and you will see some people you wish you hadn't. I'm not talking about psychiatrists and rangers that are better at pushing paperwork than hiking. I'm talking about guys in cheap black suits and people that... There was a knock on the door, and a nurse walked in with some guy wearing black scrubs. They carted me off to get a CT scan of my head. They were afraid I might have rattled my brain. It seems they were under the impression that I hit my head on a rock when I fell in the creek. I remained silent about where the cut on my forehead came from. When they rolled me back into my little room, Robert was gone. I never saw Robert again. By the time I returned to work 2 weeks later, he had applied for and received a transfer. I remained silent for the next 13 years, despite everything I've seen. Even when Eddie's body showed up on Panther's throne with his heart and eyes missing, I remained silent. I would warn new guys to stay away from the churches if we saw one, but there weren't many new guys. The rangers in our park were bound to each other and the park by our secrets. It was the brotherhood, the fraternity we could never acknowledge.